As you might have already seen in my first impressions review of the Moto X Pure Edition, I was critical of, but ultimately impressed with the device's hardware. But that's really not asking too much from an Android device these days. So what really shocked me was how decent the stock software was. In fact, even though this is one of the few phones that still has custom ROMs and kernels built for it, I was so blown away by Motorola's offering that I'm actually running both the stock ROM and stock kernel, which is something that I haven't done in years. And it's not because it looks pretty. Believe me, Motorola's take on Android is one of the dullest around, but it more than makes up for it in terms of its unique ergonomics and functionality, ultimately complementing the hardware in a useful but uncomplicated way, unlike anything else that I've ever seen before. So that's really what I want to unpack here in today's in-depth review.
I'll pick this up and check this out.
I've personally used custom ROMs with the last 3 of the 5 main mobile devices that I've owned over the years for a variety of reasons. For the Samsung devices, it was done to combat the display panel's green tint problem, while on the HTC it was to make the device usable again in the wake of a misbehaving pre-installed activation app. The only 2 devices that didn't get this treatment were bypassed because there was either no custom ROM available for it, or because the stock software was just completely adequate. I went into this operation originally just planning on installing a custom ROM, but when I saw how functional the device was stock, I actually took a step back and ultimately found it to simply not be necessary. Now, as a person who has relied on custom ROMs for over half a decade, I can tell you that this was an unusual feeling, to say the least, since I haven't seen this kind of software adequacy in over 10 years. But perhaps it's a sign that things have finally come around for the industry, because we've finally arrived to a point, as of this device's release in late 2015, when somebody finally figured out how to couple hardware that doesn't suck with software that isn't completely incompetent. The only thing I had to do with this phone was root, load up the exposed framework, and install an audio tweak package. That's it. The software experience appears to be totally functional otherwise. No misbehaving apps, very little unwanted pre-installed non-uninstallable software, and no green tint. Heck, some of the pre-installed apps are actually even pretty useful, and I no longer need to install an alternative launcher, web browser, or email client. This last shred of Motorola proper represents a beacon of that highest calling of portable computing. I guess what surprises me is how natural the whole experience feels. After using 2 generations of Android phones, I was skeptical of the idea of having to learn all these new gestures and get used to the ugly new Android experience, but the great thing about the Moto X is that the features are common sense and easy. I mean, I felt right at home with them after the first day because they actually are genuinely useful, and if it can convince a mobile skeptic like myself to give up the conventional way of doing things in favor of embracing the new features, it should be no problem for most anybody. I mean, when I first heard that this device's notification light is completely ignored by the software, I thought it was some kind of cruel and prideful joke lobbed out by a clueless Lenovo, but actually, I haven't missed it at all. The fact that any pending notifications appear on the active display when the device is picked up or reached for completely eliminates the need for it, and even though it can be enabled by way of easily installed third-party software, I just haven't found the need to do so. This truly is an all too rare case of the stock software actually doing its job. It does it in a supremely drab and boring way, but it gets it done nonetheless, and I'd much prefer that over the alternative. And that's about as philosophical as you're ever going to hear me get, so let's get back on into the fun stuff and talk about battery life and network performance. But before we do that even, let me just take time to talk about one minor quibble that I do have with the stock ROM. And I'm not sure whose fault this is, if it's Lenovo's or that of Android M, but the audio equalizer no longer applies globally, and the audio mix doesn't switch when the device is rotated. That is to say, if the phone's screen orientation is facing this way, what sound should be coming out of the speaker on the left is still coming out of the speaker that is now on the right, and the sound that should be coming out of the speaker on the right is coming out of the speaker that is on the left. The original software release for this device with Android Lollipop would actually switch it if the phone's interface was in any other orientation, but ever since Lenovo's Android M release came on the scene, this feature stopped working. It's not a huge deal as long as I stick to watching videos and listening to music in primary landscape mode when using the device without headphones, but it's just one of those things that represent the beginning of the final crumbling of Motorola as we know it. At any rate, I'm just glad that this device is what it is and that it was even allowed to exist at all under the early stages of the Lenovo corruption, because I don't think we're ever going to see anything quite like it ever again, especially not from Lenovo. That said, let's take some time to delve into the ever-important topic of wireless radios and network performance. Wi-Fi reception is outstanding, some of the best I've ever seen on a phone, and consistently 2 to 4 dBm better than the already excellent Galaxy Note 2. Cellular reception is tough to compare because I've never owned any Verizon phones before, but I can hold a telephone call in almost any part of my home, which is more than I can say for any of my previous Sprint phones, even when they were forced to roam on Verizon. But it's also somewhat expected given Motorola's pedigree and the physical size of the device. As for network compatibility, this device is almost unprecedented thanks to its support of almost every GSM, CDMA, and LTE band imaginable. No matter what wireless service provider you're on domestically or even in many foreign countries, the Pure Edition will have you covered better than most. In fact, it almost takes us to cellular nirvana by teasing dual SIM standby capability. But alas, most variants of the phone have this functionality locked out in the software, blocked off on the SIM tray, and don't have the second connector populated for it on the board. So there's still no way to use multiple lines at the same time without carrying a second phone. So close, yet so far. Audio quality is something that wasn't given much coverage in the mainstream reviews of the Moto X Pure Edition, and that's probably for good reason. The phone's sound system, dubbed Smart Boost by Motorola, is neither bad nor off the charts good, being driven, as I understand it, by the DAC that is built into the Qualcomm chipset. On paper, it's mildly inferior to the higher-end Wolfson chips found in the Galaxy Note 2 and many Apple portables, but in practice the sound quality is indiscernible. And I believe that this is because the chipsets are starting to integrate better audio, so even though the Pure lacks a dedicated DAC, those who would choose to use this phone as an audio playback device won't be missing much. As far as consuming video on the Moto X is concerned, that too is an excellent experience, whether using headphones or the built-in stereo speakers. As I mentioned in part 1, most video playing applications have the ability to temporarily hide the navigation buttons, allowing for an unimpeded full-screen video experience. Multimedia connoisseurs will be pleased to hear that the Pure Edition is in fact powerful enough to play 1920 by 1080 video encoded in the challenging X265 format, a feat that no previous mobile device of mine has been able to attain, and something that I was quite pleasantly surprised by, seeing as some of my slower computers aren't even able to keep up with such a demanding decoding task. The camera app is radically different from what I'm used to, but it's surprisingly functional. Just drag the circle to set focus and metering, spin the little dial to manually adjust exposure, drag up and down to digitally zoom, and tap anywhere to actually take the photo. It hides both the settings and gallery behind little gestures, but they weren't actually that bad once I got the hang of them. Unfortunately, 21 megapixels doesn't come cheap. The average size of each image taken measures anywhere from 3 to 8 megabytes. That, combined with the bloated nature of the newer Android system software and applications, means that even a 64 gigabyte micro SD card fills up alarmingly fast. That's to say nothing of the 16 gigabyte version of this phone by itself, which is an absolute joke. And the stock camera app lacks the ability to save files at a lower resolution. Even when using the digital zoom, it'll still expand the images to the full 5,344 by 4008 pixel resolution, which is just downright immature. Either way, compression artifacts are a little bit noticeable, and the compromise is a bit disappointing, but at least there's no obvious artificial sharpening of the image like I saw with my Galaxy Note 2. There are some aftermarket modifications that allow the camera to make use of the newer camera API as well as a more powerful camera app, potentially opening up a whole host of manual options as well as the ability to save images in a raw, uncompressed format, but those can take up significantly more space than even the already large compressed JPEGs do when shot at full resolution. So as enticing as it sounds, I'm probably just going to avoid the hassle and stick with the stock camera app for shooting stills. As far as video recording goes, the results are outstanding, with some of the best digital stabilization around. My only complaint is that there's no button to switch to video mode before shooting, which makes it difficult to line up the shot prior to recording since the field of view is diminished in video mode. This leads to a lot of videos that start out too close to the subject and then begin with me having to take a few steps back in order to compensate for this. As with still shots, resolutions and settings are quite limited, but you do still get the little spotlight ring to help tell the camcorder app what's important to you. Let's change gears a bit here and discuss battery life. This is one point that both mainstream reviews and the peanut gallery alike are in total agreement on, saying that the Moto X Pure Edition has terrible battery life. Given the track record of those resources, one has to wonder if these assertions have any basis in reality. And the unfortunate answer is that they do, actually, to a certain degree. But I'd like to take it a step further by telling you why instead of just giving some vague answer in the form of that hackneyed phrase about getting through a day. You see, the real world measures mobile battery life in the form of screen on time, which is accurately tracked by Android down to the minute. While the device will lose some power when in standby and not used, this should never be too much more than 1% per hour, which means that over the course of the average daily 12-hour usage cycle with even just acceptable signal strength, less than 15 to 20% should ever be lost to standby, unless signal strength is unusually bad. This means that screen on time is a fairly accurate representation of a device's overall endurance, with the possible exception of days in which there are long periods of screen off, audio playback, or other such background activities. I'm still working on getting some consistent numbers, but the Pure Edition looks like it'll be clocking in at between 3 and 4 hours stock, or 3.5 to 4.25 after having applied the Amplify and Greenify tweaks, which themselves only really improve standby time. For comparison, I recorded screen-on-time records as high as 4 to 5 hours on the Galaxy Note 2. Now, this is not unusable runtime by any means, and from what I've heard from my peers toting newer Galaxy S phones, it's probably even par for the course and possibly even quite decent, but it just can't match some of the stellar battery life that we were getting out of those 2012 model year phones that had big batteries, efficient processors, and screens with somewhat sane resolutions, a genre that might just be making a comeback in some of this year's newest models based on the Snapdragon 600 series. Like most newer devices, the Moto X has a super fast chipset, which it needs in order to keep up with the demands placed on it by newer, heavier versions of Android, and the fact that it has to render all those graphics at such a ludicrously high resolution. With that, the Moto X actually feels almost the same as the Note 2 in terms of general responsiveness, but I get the feeling that the Note handles its burden with ease, while the Pure Edition does break a sweat just from the basic 2D graphics of general navigation of the Android interface. Now, with all that said, the X does have one really cool trick up its sleeve in terms of power, and that is Qualcomm Quick Charge. It was one of the first devices to offer the feature, but it does it well. And for those of you not familiar, I'll fill you in here real quick. Inherent limitations of USB restrict how quickly a device can be recharged from it, so Qualcomm sort of bent the rules a bit by allowing a compatible device and a compatible power supply to temporarily negotiate a higher charging voltage of 9 or even 12 volts on demand, which is well beyond the official USB specification of 5 volts. With Quick Charge, the phone's battery can be recharged at a rate that can only be described as alarming. I mean, you can earn an extra hour or more of use in a matter of minutes. It's nothing short of astonishing. This kind of makes up for the fact that the battery is not easily replaceable, but it still doesn't quite allow me to forgive the overall short runtime. Still, it's an example of a cutting-edge feature done right. And so with that, I'll close by saying this. The Moto X Pure Edition represents the embodiment of the ideal mobile device for today's world. The coherent hardware and bland but functional software come together to provide a surprisingly useful experience. I'd describe it as upper middle class. It's not just that it has compelling features as much as it is that this phone checks so many boxes on so many people's requirements charts, whether that's the screen, the sound system, the performance, the camera, the cellular network diversity, the software quality, the aftermarket tweakability, the price, or even the all too rare occurrence of usefulness embodied within the Motorola bonus features. The Pure Edition is the device for those who are picky, and for some, like myself, who take that to an extreme, it's the only option, especially for Verizon customers. And even though some of its hardware components probably weren't the most practical choices for the device, the whole package still comes together surprisingly well, with the possible exception of that obnoxious vibrating motor. I don't know if it's just mine or if they're all like that, but if it's the latter, that's just really pathetic. Other than that, though, it's smooth sailing for the Pure Edition, and it earns the place of honor as my new daily driver, in addition to being my pick for mobile device of the year, hands down. And with that, this is Browningate signing off. Thanks for watching.
Is this what adultery feels like?